Our guest speaker is Mary Olson. She's with the Nuclear Information and Resource Service and Gender and Radiation Impact Project that she herself just started recently. And it's in Asheville, is that where the office is? Mary has been involved for many years with these issues. And today she's going to talk to us about the transportation of nuclear waste in our country. And she and Ruth, what's Ruth's last name? Thomas, who spoke to us last year at one of our meetings, know each other quite well. And these women have worked tirelessly to help spread the knowledge of what's going on in this country. Mary holds an undergraduate degree in evolutionary biology and history of science and has worked for 27 years on radioactive waste policy with the non-government organization NIRS. They are based in Washington, D.C. Mary has, how long have you been in Asheville?
2000.
Okay, so she has been working out of Asheville, and more recently has started this new the Gender and Radiation Impact Project. I'm going to let her start speaking because she has a lot to tell us, and we're really grateful that she's here today. Mary?
Okay, we're going to do this in 3 parts today, and before I start the first part, I need to apologize. Unfortunately, my laptop died over the weekend. I'm sure you've had computer failures before, and happily I'm part of a community. And this community, first and foremost, I want to acknowledge Ruth Thomas because she has affected my own thinking and activity ever since I first came to the Southeast in 1997, I think, is when I met Ruth. And we'll return to her insights in a minute. But when my computer would not start, long story I'm not going to bore you with, I realized that my colleagues who have slides online were a great resource, and that's our organization, Resource Service. And so I apologize that there are some screenshots for the slides I didn't have on the backup computer. And so I don't remember what I said the title is, but I love this title. So you get Prevention is the Cure. This is the screenshot of Nuclear Information and Resource Service. We're very much of a grassroots activist sort of place. I am taking slides from Kevin Camps, who's with Beyond Nuclear, and particularly this set that was presented to Congress in July 2018, so a very recent presentation. I'll also be talking some about Tom Clement's work at Savannah River Site, SRS Watch, which is, some people call it the bomb factory near Aiken and Augusta. And then more slides are from Dr. Arjun Makajani, a longtime colleague who's at Institute for Energy and Environmental Research. And all of these are terrific sources of information on many topics. And the slides I'm using from him are from a presentation in 2016. So a little bit out, but not too far out. And this is about the quality of what you get when you take a picture of your own screen because you're on someone else's website. So I apologize that they're not totally crystal clear. So I'm just going to quickly riffle through stuff that you may know. I'm going to try to not be too nerdy, but we're going to be talking about radioactive waste. And in order to understand where it comes from, some of it is from the ground, from Earth, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the part that's most worrying when you put it on the road or the rail or a barge, and believe me, all 3 are possible, are the products of fission. And fission is that moment that we invented. Yes, it does happen in teeny tiny amounts in some uranium deposits, but Human beings invented this activity in 1942 in Chicago, and it was very quickly turned into a weapons program called the Manhattan Project, and after that into the Peaceful Atom Program. That this shot on the lower right is the Oconee reactors. Maybe we want to turn this off right there. Pictures could be a little bit brighter. Is that better? Okay. So that's the Oconee reactors in upstate South Carolina, closest to here. The point of these two pictures is simply that splitting an atom releases heat. And if you split trillions and upon trillions of atoms, you get a whole lot of heat. And in the case of a weapon, the heat is the reason to use the weapon. It's just destructive, it's a big fireball. In the case of the energy program, it's controlled. For every split, there's one more split. It doesn't go into that big fireball, but the heat is what is boiling water, and the boiling water, just like a coal or gas turbine, is what's making electric power. My mother had the idea that somehow the radioactivity was making electricity. No, it's just making heat, and the heat is being used to boil water. So on the left is this picture of a neutron hitting a uranium atom. Out come the smaller green circles, which are the fragments of the uranium atom. And we'll get to those in a second. And other neutrons. You start with one, and you start into this cascade for a nuclear weapon, where one leads to many, and many lead to many, and it all goes geometric. But it's those fission fragments that end up in what we call waste, and which we will be talking about today. And I just wanted to give a quick rundown. Not many of my slides are this wordy, but it's important to know that you've heard of these things. Tritium is a radioactive hydrogen, and in our environment it bonds into a natural water molecule. There's nothing different about that water molecule except for that the hydrogen in it is emitting energy as it goes, and it crosses the placental barrier if it gets taken into a woman's body by drinking or by breathing. Cesium, if it gets inside the body, it mimics potassium, so it goes to muscles, including the heart. Strontium mimics calcium, which goes to the bones, teeth, and also to the muscle. Iodine, like any type of iodine, even if it's radioactive, seeks out the thyroid. And the actinides, meaning uranium, plutonium, and heavier, are all metals. And so they go to the body, impact the body like any other type of heavy metal, whether it's lead or whatever. The stomach, liver, bone, and gonads are the primary places. Now, I know this is going to look nerdy, but we really do need to understand about plutonium, because we're going to be talking a little bit about it today. So it's the same picture on the left. On the right, I've added a couple features. On the left is the kind of uranium that will split, the one that the Manhattan Project was all about figuring out how to concentrate so that you could make a bomb out of highly enriched fissile uranium. That's the uranium story. But the most common form of uranium, I'm picturing in blue, it won't split. But it's present in all of the fuel, in all of the reactors that use uranium worldwide. This is the most common form of uranium. It's also sometimes called depleted when it's pulled out in the enrichment process. And it doesn't split. So when it gets hit by a neutron, every once in a while, not real often, but every once in a while, that neutron gets sucked into that U-238 and out pops your plutonium-239. So there's trace quantities of plutonium on our planet in those places where natural fission did happen in uranium deposits, but they're parts per billion or parts per million. The industrial quantities of plutonium on our planet are all produced inside fission reactors where you have uranium fuel, you have neutrons flying around, and some of the neutrons produce plutonium-239. Most reactors have about 1%. So out of every 100 U-238s, you get one plutonium-239, and that adds up. So this is a table showing, kind of nerdy, but I just want to show that this is, on the left side, different types of radioactive uranium and plutonium. In the middle is what you have when you have fresh fuel that's never been used in a reactor, and it's 96% that type of uranium that doesn't split, and the U-235 makes up the rest of it, and that's the part that will, that's going to generate that heat. But when you get over to the right-hand column, it's a mess. It's all kinds of different stuff. Your amount of 238 has gone down. You suddenly show plutonium. I'm not going to dwell there, but it's one of Arjun's slides. He's a physicist, what can I say? Okay, so stand back for a minute. We have all these industrial activities going on. They've been going on since the Manhattan Project in the 1940s. And on the left side, we have uranium mining, where we start with uranium in the ground. The largest deposits in the world are in Australia, Canada, and parts of Kazakhstan. There are many other places that have uranium, including right on the border of North Carolina and Virginia, that has not been opened up, and people are pretty determined to keep it that way. Would change their whole lifestyle in that area. Their economic base would change from the style of horse country that they have going, and they like that. Each of these arrows is both waste and also transport. So from the mining, I have several friends who are rolling over in their graves because it doesn't go straight to enrichment. It actually goes to milling and conversion, 2 more industrial steps, 2 more transportation links, 2 more waste streams, then to enrichment where that concentration of the fissile materials happen, then to the reactor. And in the reactor is where the plutonium is produced. And that gets sent off, if you want to harvest it, to something called reprocessing, which happened at the bomb plant in South Carolina for many years. A little teeny bit is still going on. And both highly enriched uranium and plutonium can be channeled into a weapons program. So I'm not going to dwell here, but basically this gloved hand is holding unused uranium pellets. Uranium fuel is produced as a ceramic pellet, and then those pellets are stacked up inside a fuel rod. And that metal structure there is the casing for a fuel rod. Unirradiated, before it goes in the reactor, we could have a big fuel assembly sitting right here, and we'd get a teeny tiny dose from some of the americium that builds up in the natural uranium, but it wouldn't be a big deal. If it was an irradiated fuel rod, we would have all died in the first minute or 2 that we were here, but it would take us several weeks for that to occur. Anybody who was further away would have a major dose, probably not die. But if you were in this room with a irradiated fuel assembly, it would be lethal levels of radiation if it was not shielded. And you would not fall over dead, but you would have a miserable, horrible time as you died. And that's called radiation sickness, and this fuel is so incredibly radioactive when it comes out of the reactor core that it is some of the most high-risk material on the planet. So, sometimes I can't understand my own sentence structure. 19% of our electric power in 2018 came from nuclear power. And in our lights right now, there's some percentage that's coming from nuclear. But 95% of the radioactivity in the waste is generated by these big industrial operations, because they're splitting atoms 24/7 unless they're down for refueling or for some other reason. And so each of these reactors produces the equivalent of about 1,000 to 1,100 of the bomb that was used to destroy Hiroshima. And by that I mean the persistent radioactivity. I don't mean that they're exploding. I just mean they're producing in the waste that much radioactivity and that much heat, which is being generated out into the cooling water or up into the atmosphere. So this highly radioactive waste is very hot. You can stop the fission, but you can't turn off the heat. The heat is there and the decay process is ongoing. So initially, this waste is stored in water, and I want to walk over here and show you that the surface of this pool is really right up at this level. And it's kind of hard to see. This is one of the screenshots, but there's an assembly being pulled up by this structure that's a crane. And so it's probably about 12, 14, 16 feet underwater. When these pools, which by the way, they were only really designed for 20 years of storage, and then they started re-racking to consolidate because they lengthened the licenses from 20 years to 40 years. Now they're getting extensions out to 60 years. So these pools have gotten very full. And most reactor sites are offloading into these dry containers. And there's a lot of issues about containers. I'm going to stay focused on transport, but suffice it to say, a lot of these could be moved, a lot of them can't be moved. We don't really know how to unload them because once they leave the pool, the water's being circulated in that pool and the heat's being pulled out. So when you put it into dry storage, it's just being, air convection. And so the temperature inside is much higher. So unloading one of these babies is not the same as, you can't just go backwards. So it's all a bit of a challenge right now. But I'm going to try to stay focused on the mandate, which is, I should have mentioned to begin with, part 1 is giving you this context. Part 2, I met with some of the women who organized this event, and they got really interested in this part about female bodies reacting to radiation differently than male bodies, and so I'm going to give a short version of that, and then we're going to come back to the transport. But this slide is basically a prompt for me to tell you that the existing reactors with the licenses that are in place will produce over 100,000 metric tons of this highly radioactive, thermally hot waste. And that means there'll be about 1,000 tons of plutonium, which is what I was telling you is about 1%. And that would be 120,000 nuclear bombs if separated. So it's clearly something that we have produced, we haven't had a lot of conversation about, and yet it poses a real challenge to future generations to figure out what to do about this stuff. This is Dr. Makajani's slide. He says indefinite storage could be catastrophic, and I agree with him. His number is that if just the strontium-90, and this is a thought experiment, it would never happen this way, but if the strontium-90 in that waste were diluted uniformly, it could contaminate the entire freshwater supply, groundwater and surface water of the world to about 60 times U.S. drinking water standard. So this is dangerous stuff, and it has a global level of potential impact. And the good news is it hasn't all leaked out. We know where it is. And the goal is to keep this from happening. So then the last point here is that if you have a reactor operating for 60 years, the amount of plutonium that would be generated could contaminate the whole Ogallala water aquifer to 25 times the drinking water limit for thousands of years. And we're going to come to why the Ogallala is specifically important and where it is. But I want to show you that reactors pools have filled, and all of these reactor sites, this is from the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, we're not going to go into all the names, but you can see there are clusters of reactors that the pools have filled, and they correspond to where most of the reactors are. And you can see in our region there's a big cluster in the Great Lakes, southwestern, and then in the northeast, big clusters of nuclear power reactors, and all of these have the external outdoor dry storage. So as these reactors close, there's a pressure to do something with this waste. And our federal program currently has identified a site in Nevada. There is not a waste site built there. There's just an exploratory tunnel in a place called Yucca Mountain, which is on the edge of the Nevada test site at the Nellis Air Force Base, not that far from Las Vegas, which is one of our fastest growing cities. And Yucca Mountain has been deemed by many independent experts as unsuitable for this waste. And I'll be glad to take questions about that, but I'm going to keep moving fairly rapidly to tell you that Yucca Mountain has been on hold for more than a decade. The facility is not built, there is no waste there, there have been no transports to it. But this is a picture of all the reactors in the United States where the little round circles are, and the prospective transport routes to this location here. That's the Yucca Mountain site. But there is currently 2 new proposals, one in Texas and one in New Mexico. The black triangle and the red circle are proposed consolidated storage sites. Again, the reactors are pictured with the radiation symbols, the transport routes are there. Texas has got all its counties because some people in Texas made this map. Every state has counties, just particularly that one is pictured for the state legislators there to understand that you can't just snap your fingers and have highly radioactive waste travel from a reactor to a destination without going on interstate highways and common carrier rails, and in some cases barge shipments, including on the Great Lakes, and over decades of time. So this is in large part why many of us independent analysts feel that moving the waste may become absolutely necessary. However, moving it more than once is absolutely unnecessary. We should have a firmly planted permanent program and then move the waste to that one or more. Maybe there'll be more than one permanent site. Maybe we'll figure that we should reduce transportation by having regional centers. I don't know, but I do know that this particular set of proposals is about moving the existing structures that you saw in the dry cask storage picture to new sites without stopping storage at reactors, so they become one more site or two more sites. So supposedly these sites in New Mexico are consent-based siting, and how they're defining consent-based is being able to get a contract with a corporation and or having local elected officials agree to the proposal with no consideration of all of the communities between the point of origin and the point of destination. So the second point here is that science should be the starting point, and then communities should have a role. But let's start with the science to be sure that a site is suitable for storage of waste. So this is the last slide of part one, which is to show what has been promoted as the alternative. The Texas and New Mexico sites are called CIS, Consolidated Interim Storage. Interim storage is happening today. It's happening at Oconee, it's happening at McGuire and Catawba, and many reactors, all the reactors have generated waste, and waste is in storage, and it is interim because none of the reactor sites are really qualified for the million years of isolation that this waste is going to require. So we have interim storage. It is not particularly robust for security or accidents, and so the hardened on-site storage concept has been promoted by independent analysts as a way to say, okay, maybe we're talking decades or maybe even 100 years where it is, but we need to be working on a permanent site at the same time, so let's harden it in the interim. And over 200 community organizations and even a couple of states have signed on to this concept that the waste should stay where it is for the interim, but be hardened where it is so it's more secure, and then be moved one time in the future when it's going to a permanent location. In an event very much like this, in 2009, a woman asked me, is radiation more harmful to my body compared to a man? And I had never heard the idea that gender might have something to do with how radiation impacts living systems. And I have to apologize. Gender is now a much more complex concept than it was in 2009. I still use it because it's very rare for me to be in a room with mostly other women. It's very typical for me to be in a room with almost all men. And if I stood up and said sex and radiation, it would kind of throw us into a totally different place. So forgive me, I'm appropriating the term gender to soften the issue. But it has really to do with biological sex. And I'm going to just walk you through fairly quickly the findings that came out of that question. And they mirror the work of Dr. Arjun Makajani, whose slides I've already shared on radioactive waste. He had done his own independent look in 2006. I did not get the memo. I did not get the memo about EPA following up on that. And when this woman asked me, I was just floored. It kind of was one of those places where your brain goes bzzz, and you just stop. And then in 2011, 3 nuclear power plants blew up in Japan. And my organization tasked me to reach out to Japan, and I said, yes, I will do that, but first I have to answer this question. And I called a mentor who was at the end of her life, Dr. Rosalie Bertel, and Rosalie said, well, Mary, you'll have to go to the data because I don't know the answer to that question. And she directed me to the story I have unfolded. And this is the website of the new non-government organization that's dedicated to raising money for real solid academic research, basic science research on these questions, because we need more than my PowerPoints. So the first point is that radiation does not always cause harm. Our bodies have incredible repair mechanisms, and very often radiation does not leave what you would call a disease or a disability or any other problem with a cell. If it's high enough, it just kills the cell, and then there's really no problem because our body absorbs that. So I just want to be clear that what we're talking about is something you have to study in a large group of people because it's a statistical phenomenon of excess cancer from these low doses. I already told you about high doses. It can kill you, but that's very, very, very high. You're basically being cooked like a microwave oven. So that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the kind of thing you get at the doctor's office and the dentist's office. So radiation's invisible, but we can see damage it does to chromosomes. This is a bunch of different types of damage. We see when there has been damage to a reproductive cell. This happens not only to plants, but to all types of life. But our regulators and most research has focused on cancer as an outcome from radiation exposure. So the rest of what I'm going to be talking about is in terms of cancer outcomes. And I know that that's a charged thing, and I apologize to do it in a fairly brusque way today, but believe me, I know that what I'm going to be talking about is the lives of people, real people, not just numbers, and I'm sure that we all share some of this. But this is the summary slide on how radiation causes cancer. The energy from a radioactive decay hits a cell and causes damage to the DNA that's not repaired. Remember I told you it can be repaired? Well, in this picture it's not repaired. And oftentimes the damaged cell will just sit there for years, even decades. And at some point there'll be either another trigger, or we don't know exactly why it grows into a tumor. So the data set that I was sent to were the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And over 100,000 people survived in those two cities that were demolished by the first use of the first nuclear weapons. Our nation, our government decided to drop those bombs on cities full of people. And the survivors, over 100,000 of them, because they were in robust structures, were grouped by the age they were in August of 1945. August 6th was Hiroshima, August 9th was Nagasaki. And so from birth to 80 years old, people were grouped by 5-year age groups. And there was really no surprise that the people who were the youngest in August 1945 had the most cancer, even when adjusted for lifespans and everything like that. Because we've known that children are more likely, because their cells are dividing more rapidly, a smaller body gets a higher dose. There's just lots of reasons we've understood that radiation was more harmful to children. Now, I did not collect any data. I went to a report that the National Academy of Science put out that my mentor sent me to that has published in it tables of data. But it wasn't disaggregated for male to female. It was in there male to female, but not to these simple ratios. So this is the surprise. In the youngest age group, for every one boy who at some point over their lifespan, this is 60 years of data in 2006, these people were tracked over their entire lives, the cancers were counted. So for everybody who was a male between the ages of birth and 5 who was irradiated in 1945, for every one of them that got cancer, 2 girls in the same age group got cancer. That was a surprise. I'm not going to dwell here, but this is the summary in graphic form. So along the bottom is the age of exposure, not the age when they get their cancer. Cancers are occurring across the next 60 years. But they're tracked from the age they were, and then the numbers are reported almost like a bar graph. So that doubling is on the left-hand axis. And you can see that the pink line and blue line are different the whole way. They never cross. So in every age group, there is a detectable difference between male and female, and in all cases, females have been impacted more by the radiation. I'm going the wrong way, sorry. Now, the one thing I've run into with our federal regulators is they're not medical or biologically trained. They have backgrounds in physics, engineering, and health physics, and that's all great, but they think that little girls are a subpopulation. We're not going to dwell here, but little girls are not a subpopulation. You can't get a male or female of the adult variety without a little girl. We are an inextricable link in the human life cycle. You cannot treat us as a subpopulation. But that's how they've gotten around dealing with this problem that they have. Because in a moment you'll find out what their problem is. But amongst the Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors, adults, they were irradiated as adults. These are deaths now. For every 2 men who died of cancer of the same age group, 3 women died. So only a 50% difference. That's that pink and blue graph converging. But the difficulty is that all of our radiation standards are based on the reference man. And he is defined as 25 to 30 years old, specific height, weight, lifestyle. He's Caucasian. You know, he's not a Native American. He's not an islander. He's not eating fish along the Savannah River. He's a normal guy. He's a GI. And that guy was lit upon in the early Manhattan Project years and has not left us. He's still the basis for every radiation decision that the regulators at the federal level make. And yet, when you compare the people who were exposed as little girls, and these are not little girl cancers, these are lifetime cancers in females exposed at that age, compared to the green circle is the data underlying reference man, it is a 10 times difference. There is 10 times more radiation not being reported as a source of cancer in our populations than is occurring. And the decision makers don't see it. They only see the reference man data. Oops, sorry. We don't know why. This is why I want to sponsor research in big academic institutions, not activists doing it. I want mainstream people out there looking at what is going on. My mentor who sent me to the data, she lived long enough to hear the results, and she said, well, maybe it's because there's more reproductive tissue in a female body. So the global guys, again, I'm going to leave that. We don't know what it is. Nobody has really gone to the mat to figure it out. But I just want to say, this is not a women's issue. I mean, I'm really excited to find this website, Women in New York, who are doing just regular fundraising, but they're putting their funding to science. And then last year, Scientific American came out with that cover. And I'm just really pleased that we're in a period where there's movement and where hopefully we can begin to actually protect our species and other species, because if you only think it's an adult male, that's not going to get you very far down that road.
You're talking just about the exposure causing cancer. Are there studies as to neurological diseases?
In my own experience, I can tell you that there's a great many impacts to the body from a radiation exposure. And quite a few medical practitioners have documented that we're as individual on reaction to radiation as people are to different foods or to different medications. You know, what's okay for one is not always okay for another, but there's sort of a general range of impacts that include the immune system, the endocrine system. I'm trying to think about your question about nerves in particular. Anyway, not much literature, and mostly dismissed by the mainstream because the regulators have chosen to only look at cancer. So these other matters are things I would love to see documented by especially this generation, because a lot of us have had quite a bit of radiation for one reason or another. And we know that there have been consequences to our bodies that are not necessarily what is being talked about. Anything else? Okay. So I'm just going to go back up to this slide briefly to point out that all of these activities in this nice little flow chart are in communities. And most of these activities happen in many places on the planet. So there's a lot of people who are exposed in the incidental activity, as well as workers who are exposed by having the jobs. And so it's just not that rare. Plus we have the naturally occurring radiation. We have our activity that makes that exposure higher. Like every time we go in an airplane, we have less shielding from the atmosphere. When people go into space, they get quite a big dose. You know, not lethal, I'm not saying that, but a lot compared to here. When I'm in a 30,000 foot plane, I'm afraid to say my detector isn't working today, but I have a little detector and it might be 20 on the ground and it's like 600 up at 30,000 feet. So it's not a lethal level, but it's a lot compared to on the ground. Radon in our homes, dental, medical, diagnosis, treatment, all of that is adding to our incidental exposures. Dr. David Richardson led a big team that started looking at radiation workers at nuclear power plants in the United States and Europe. They have a big data set, and a data set's different than big data. I'm not going to take a lot of time on it, but basically you have to have a bunch of people who are getting the thing you're studying and then a bunch of other people who are not getting the thing you're studying so that you can compare them. And David does outstanding epidemiology, and he went to the in-works data set with the question that our friend asked a moment ago of what about all of these little exposures? Do they add up, or is it better to get lots of little ones than one big one? Because my findings were from people who all got one big one. And the answer from the in-works data set is yes, many little exposures that add up have the same risk profile for cancer that one equivalent amount of radiation coming to you all at once. So whether you get it all at once or you get it in lots of little pieces, it's the same risk factor. Now that's a very well done study in a very well constructed data set, but it's why we need more work, because that's the first study that's actually tackled that and come out with a clear answer. Okay, so I'm now going to turn to the transportation pieces, and I need a time check because we didn't start at a crisp time. How much do I have left?
I'm not keeping track of time.
No, you have about 10 minutes.
Okay, good. So nationwide, we're talking about, depending on whether it's truck or rail, somewhere between 5,000 and 50,000 shipments. So the scenario has a lot of wiggle in it as to what might happen. But these are prospective might happen shipments, right? They have not happened yet. But this is the map of taking the irradiated fuel from the dry storage and the wet storage at reactor sites and taking it to Nevada. And here again is the map of doing the same thing to Texas and New Mexico. But these are proposed. They're not happening today. For the most part, very little of this fuel has ever been moved. The melted fuel from 3 Mile Island went to Idaho. Duke likes to move some fuel around, Progress before it moves some fuel around within their own reactor fleet because they have a big pool over in Durham, so they took, you know, I'm not saying there hasn't been any shipments, but not this big, huge, decades-long, thousands and thousands of shipments program. And hopefully before we do it, we have a really clear plan, and as I say, it's going once. But now I'm going to turn to the issue that our friend Ruth Thomas has identified. And it is a different set of waste, a fundamentally different set of waste. And it is happening as we speak. Maybe not this minute, but this year. These shipments have already begun rolling. We have no idea how many there will be total. First we thought there'd be 70, then we heard there'd be 50. Then we heard, oh, maybe that's just the first and beginning of the program. We have no idea how many total shipments, and we have no idea how many have occurred of that total. But these shipments are not from a nuclear energy reactor. They are from medical production of isotopes, which I think most people would think is a pretty important thing to have happen because nuclear medicine is one of the options your doctor has if you're really sick. However, this waste is generated at a place called Chalk River in Canada, in Ontario, top of the picture of the map where that red is. And previously, this waste was stabilized and stored in Canada at Chalk River, which has tons of other types of waste already. It's not like it's a pristine site. And this has been going on for decades without any shipping to South Carolina. Now, as far as we know, these are the first and only shipments that are liquid. Highly radioactive, like the fuel I've been talking about, but liquid. The reason it's liquid is because the fuel is generated and then it is dissolved in acid in order to take the medical isotopes out. Here comes the second problem. It still has the plutonium and the highly enriched uranium because they didn't reprocess, which is the term for hacking it up and dissolving it in acid is reprocessing. They didn't reprocess it for making nuclear weapons, they reprocessed it for medical materials. Therefore, it's not only liquid highly radioactive waste, it is waste that could go critical. So it has to be in subcritical containers. Okay, all right. Now this picture shows one possible route. We have no idea how it's actually traveling. We believe it may be traveling more than one way. I'm about to show you the truck picture. But this is Ontario. This is Savannah River site. This picture shows 77, but 77 goes right through Charlotte and Columbia. From my own research into regulations, they don't set routes, they approve routes. The routes are approved on a each shipment basis. And 81 continues on down here and then drops down through Asheville to 26 and on down right through here. So I wouldn't rule out the idea that shipments are coming right through these communities, Tryon and Asheville and Johnson City, etc., on the parallel 277, which is 26. Or 25, after Hendersonville. So because they've never done these shipments before, they took a container, an old container for moving irradiated fuel, relatively small fuel assemblies, and modified it. And they put in a whole bunch of, I don't have a picture, but little jugs. And the little jugs are in a special rack. And the special rack is to keep the little jugs, you know, the liquid jugs from moving, but also to keep the amount of fissile material, either highly enriched uranium or plutonium, that can start a little fission reaction in there, small enough amounts of it that that doesn't happen. Okay, I am going to invite you to explore things on this table and not spend time with these slides that are too detailed. But basically, a community of people identified the fact that these shipments were coming to the United States because of an import license. We got involved because we felt that there should be an environmental impact statement done on something as different and precedent-setting as shipping this type of material. The federal agencies denied that request, and so we went to court. And we got a lawyer, and we did a federal lawsuit. And unfortunately, our courts are not manned and womaned by people who are expert in this stuff, and they kind of like to just believe the federal agency. If they say it's okay, then it's okay. So pretty much the shipments started rolling, and we've had members of Congress, especially Representative Higgins from New York State up near Niagara, because the waste route, one of the routes anyway, would have gone right through Niagara. This one shows Syracuse and on down. Anyway, there has been efforts to try and put a bright light on this. But I can tell you that when the first shipment came to Savannah River site, there was a leak. There was also a discovery that the shielding wasn't adequate for the workers. They stopped the shipments for a period of time, and as far as we know, they are now rolling. I don't have a slide that shows you apparently the container in the truck, but I have a handout that actually has a picture showing that it's just a regular, like from a boat, the shipping container, that type of barrier around it. And this actually allows them to not meet the radiation standards that apply to the other types of shipments. Just having that separator so that a person couldn't get closer than the distance of that. And the metal is some shielding. Anyway, they're allowed to exceed by 3 to 5 times, depending on what the total is when the exception is made. So I'm gonna just pretty much wrap up, except for to say that there's all kinds of problems, fires and floods, and I'm gonna come back to that slide because there's more floods and more fires. And when we talk about terrorism, I really don't say a whole lot because personally I'm a fan of security and I would never want to contribute to a bad situation. So all I say is that there is the potential for it. But this is the one I'm going to finish with. Reference man does not represent our whole species by a factor of 10 if you're a little girl, by a factor of 50% if you're a woman. But significant impact is also an interesting thing, the way our federal government puts it together. Because when something is a federal national program, which it would be very hard to argue that the Chalk River shipments are a federal national program. Very likely they're just a jobs program for the Savannah River site. Because they have a big processing facility down there that they're trying to keep open, and so having a client is maybe why those shipments are happening at all. But for the irradiated fuel that might go to Yucca Mountain or Texas or New Mexico, I was told specifically by a member of the Department of Energy in the late 1990s that the reason that they deem that there is no significant impact from the transportation of nuclear waste is because those are federal programs and any impact is averaged across the entire US population. And so even if you have a city like Atlanta that would have routes traversing it in several different directions, even more routes in Chicago, both of waste coming through from other states as well as leaving that state. If there was a major accident that even spread just a tiny percentage of particles of irradiated fuel that led to exposure of, say, a fifth of the city, at that rate, you'd have 1 to 2 million people impacted at some way or another. I'm not saying they all get cancer. I'm not saying that there are immediate deaths. I'm just saying there are impacts. Those impacts are not significant in the federal because they are averaging them across. In 2016, when I made this slide, it was 325 million. I don't really know what today's population is, but it's enough that if you're only talking 1 or 2 million people impacted for the federal agency, that's acceptable. That is acceptable. That is not significant. So I'm inviting you to think about what is significant for Tryon, for Greenville, for Aiken, for any of these communities. What could change your local economy drastically if any of this stuff were to get out? And what is it that we can still do, even though the shipments are happening now? It's still possible for questions to be asked, for studies to be launched, for elected officials to have second thoughts, for, I mean, look at all the things that get undone all the time, right? Why not this one? So with that, I'm going to say thank you very much for your attention, and apologize to my friend Tom because I didn't even get to the pit factory they want to put at Savannah River site and the letters you could send, so they're on the table over there, and say thank you very much.
Mary, I have one question about the transportation of the nuclear waste. One thing I've been wondering is, what about the shielding on the highways? Just driving, like the driver in the truck and the people who are sitting in the cars in the traffic jams.
Indeed, this is the question about a container that has got no problems, well made, not in an accident, not leaking. a truck that did not get in an accident, but let's say a landslide happens and you're all tied up for hours and the truck is in the lane next to you. The permissible limit for the public is for the container to emit 2 chest x-rays an hour at 6 feet. It's a lot more right at the surface, but we're kind of assuming that nobody would go right to the surface. And so if it's a hot day and you roll your car windows down and there's basically no shielding, you could start getting the amount that you would get from a diagnostic thing that your doctor said you needed for no benefit at all and no notice at all. Now the driver, definitely, it's a trick to keep the driver within the worker limits for the year, but they have the most shielding between the cab and the container, and then the container itself has shielding at the ends, specifically for the driver. But the driver has to stop and inspect the container several times a day, and it's in that activity that the doses are really pushing the limits for the federal limits for a radiation worker.
Since we're in Polk County, and obviously the land comes through Polk County for the line, do they have to ask a permit to come through, or they just take it as normal route and they don't have to ask us? Thank you very much.
We have some reason to believe, but we don't actually know whether the liquid shipments, they notify the governor. Typically, when there's a high-risk shipment, the nuclear
That's the
agencies
governor. I'm talking
notify
about
the governor. I'm just indicating that that is the only level of notification that I'm aware of. Now, I have friends who work for emergency response agencies up closer to Asheville, and they do get courtesy notifications from time to time, especially for submarine fuel that's being shipped, because it's that highly enriched fissile material, but the difference is it's solid. It's not liquid. So this is a huge precedent that's being set, and it is a clear and present danger to all of our water. And you know, I mean, if you're 3 miles away from it, you probably don't have any impact, except for that if it gets in the water, well, then what, you know? If you're right on top of it, this stuff has that level of radiation that it's lethal.
And why are they shipping this from Canada to Savannah River site? Have you ever figured that out?
It's a supposition, a theory, that the Savannah River site has the facility to stabilize this particular type of waste, and they want clients, they want business, and so this waste coming from Canada is giving them work, whereas without any work they might close down. You know, they only get federal budget if they have mission, so that's a whole set of issues that is placing the rest of the country at great risk, because as far as we know, for more than 2 decades they've been stabilizing the waste and storing that waste in Canada without shipping it to the United States.
Do the trucks transporting this waste, are they marked in any way?
They should be placarded, but I've never seen one. And the problem is that if they decide to put a tarp over, they're allowed to tarp over the placard for a certain amount of time under certain conditions. These are weird little rules, but they have them. They have them.
So they don't have to have on the back, like when we're in back of a truck and it has the symbol for the type of chemical they might be carrying. Isn't there any type of identification? You know, they'll have a color coded that none of us really understand the color coded, but we see it there.
Well, radioactive materials are supposed to be placarded with the radiation symbol.
Right.
On these shipments, which are not commercial, I'm not 100% sure.
That's
We've
right.
been asking the question and we've been told, yes, they will be placarded. No one has seen one. They're not in an exposed, you know, a lot of the nuclear shipments you can tell by the container, just the shape of the container, that if it's not placarded, it's empty, but if it is placarded, it's got something pretty tough in it. But these are inside that regular shipping corrugated metal rectangular box. So it's my understanding that they are placarded, but I have seen myself where other types of nuclear shipments, like a contaminated component coming from a reactor to be repaired or treated in some way. They put a big tarp over the whole thing, and sometimes that tarp covers the radiation symbol. And it seems to be driver prerogative. I'm being a little bit wishy-washy, I understand that, but we have only had wishy-washy answers every time we tried to get information. And, you know, there's a separate set of shipments I haven't focused on, but they've been shipping plutonium from South Carolina to Nevada. And those shipments are completely not placarded. And I say hallelujah. Who the hell would want to have someone know that that was plutonium going down the road? I'll accept the problem that might occur for the security that results from that.
As they're taking it down the road, is there any type of a program that you would include highway departments rather than going down 85 with the tanker truck and all these people? There's so many little tiny shortcut ways and little highways that are out of the way with virtually no traffic on them. Why can't they close off, you know, use those roads where there's less exposure to anybody at all rather than just going down major thoroughfares?
I applaud your thinking, and I applaud your question, and all I can say is that your elected officials and your federal agencies are where to take that question. I don't want to shut down the question because I think it's a perfectly legitimate question that should be asked and answered.
I mean, if they're going to move it, and
Right.
obviously they are going to move it regardless of what anybody says, they're already doing it, it would make sense to maybe just put up barriers like you do when the trees are down and you can't go on that road for, you know, a day or two.
I hear you. I hear you. Those are very good questions. And as part of what would drive a shipment on to 26 rather than 77, because the instant population, if there were a problem at many points along 77, is so much higher than the instant population along the route from 81 coming down to Johnson City. So
I mean, it is
these
gonna
are
impact
complex
somebody, but
questions.
wow, somewhere you need to do something.
Are they required to ship at certain times of the year? Let me finish this question. We have experienced 2 years of excessive rain. We have slides. We have 3 people killed in Polk County alone from a slide.
I'm
We
sorry to
have
hear it.
Interstate 40 right now that is closed down east and west. Hypothetically speaking, if they were shipping that road and all of a sudden it's shut down, you can't get through, can they ship January through December, or do they ship in the better climates, or what?
As far as I'm aware, there's no regulatory restriction. One would hope that they have the kind of native knowledge that you're talking about.
Well, we got snow, we got ice, we got, I mean.
Yeah, I know.
We've got people all over the United States.
But then you've got heat, and heat is the enemy of this fissile material. So that's another factor, and I'm not in charge of this program, so I can't tell you what they're doing and not doing, but I applaud the question and I encourage the communication. We sent a letter a couple of years ago. I have to say that this has kind of gone underground since we lost in court, but a bunch of North Carolina organizations, Clean Water for North Carolina, Ruth's Environmentalist Inc., Mountain True, NC Warren, Nuclear Information Resource Service, Physicians for Social Responsibility, and Women's International League for Peace and Freedom sent a letter to, at that point, new Governor Roy Cooper of North Carolina, suggesting things that he as governor could do to put a spotlight on this. He doesn't have the authority to stop it, but he could require inspections at both borders to be sure that nothing happened in the course of the transit, or ask the congressional delegation to hold hearings on it, or, you know, we asked for was an environmental impact statement. It wasn't like we were really getting in the road, we were just trying to say, let's look at all of these factors. So I encourage people very much to carry forward these concerns, because these shipments are happening, and we don't know for how much longer.
How do people do that? Where do they write? What do they do?
Well, I actually think it might take setting up some meetings and sitting down and talking about it. And
Where?
I went after Cooper. I didn't actually get a meeting with him. But any state governor has standing in this picture. Any member of Congress who's on a committee of oversight or connected to somebody with a committee of oversight who could call for a hearing on these matters. Any member of Congress who might want to draft legislation. Representative Higgins tried to get a resolution calling for the environmental impact statement we were trying to get. So, you know, elected officials at the local level have a better chance of getting a hearing at the state level. State level officials have a better chance of getting a hearing at the federal level. So you start where you are, sit down, talk about it, decide whether it's important enough to pursue. And I'm not the only person. There's a bevy of people whose slides I've pulled in, and there's a lot more people behind them who have the expertise to go to those meetings and make the case for why this is a very bad precedent. Very bad precedent.
Well, we certainly thank you so much, Mary, for being here.